Rarely does a single decision destroy a career before the person making it even realizes what they have done, but Officer Daniel Brooks was only seconds away from learning that truth the hardest way possible. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the heavy wooden doors swung open and every person inside the chamber rose to their feet. Daniel adjusted his uniform with the confidence of a man who believed the law always stood behind him. He had testified in court before, answered difficult questions before, and walked into federal buildings convinced he understood exactly how power worked. Today felt no different until the woman entered. She moved with calm, measured steps, dressed in a simple navy suit that drew little attention to itself, carrying only a thin leather folder beneath one arm. There was no dramatic entrance, no security detail surrounding her, no announcement beyond the courtroom deputy's steady voice. Yet the instant Daniel looked up and recognized her face, the color drained for his own. 3 days earlier, he had ripped her driver's license into pieces on the side of a busy street, while dozens of strangers watched in silence. 3 days earlier, he had laughed at her request for respect. 3 days earlier, he had decided that the woman standing before him did not deserve the dignity he freely offered everyone who looked different from her. Now that same woman climbed the steps toward the federal bench without rushing, without anger, without even looking in his direction. The courtroom remained standing as she took her seat beneath the seal of the United States. Only then did the clerk announce the words that turned Daniel's confidence into disbelief. The Honorable Judge Vanessa Carter presiding. A quiet gasp rolled through the gallery. Daniel's breathing slowed, not because he felt calm, but because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Judge Vanessa Carter. The name echoed through every memory from 3 days before like a warning he should have recognized but never did. He remembered the folded registration resting neatly on her dashboard. He remembered the courthouse parking permit attached to the windshield. He remembered the phone that kept vibrating with calls she politely declined. He remembered every clue that had seemed meaningless because he had already made up his mind about who she was before speaking a single respectful word. As Judge Carter settled into her chair, she calmly reviewed the file placed before her. Her expression revealed nothing. No satisfaction, no resentment, no desire for revenge. That frightened Daniel more than anger ever could. Across the room, attorneys exchanged uncertain glances while spectators sensed an invisible tension they could not yet explain. Somewhere in the back row, someone whispered that the officer looked as though he had seen a ghost. They were wrong. Daniel had not seen a ghost. He had just come face to face with the consequence of believing that authority belonged only to people who looked like him. And as the judge quietly lifted her eyes for the first time, the truth neither of them could escape had already begun 3 days earlier on an ordinary street during what should have been a routine traffic stop. 3 days earlier, the morning had begun like countless others in downtown Richmond. Commuters filled the streets with the familiar rhythm of weekday life. Traffic lights changed in predictable cycles, and the crisp spring air carried the distant sound of construction and impatient car horns. Judge Vanessa Carter guided her dark blue sedan through the city with quiet focus, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while the other occasionally reached toward the leather folder on the passenger seat. Inside were carefully organized notes for a federal hearing scheduled later that morning, a case that had demanded months of preparation and absolute impartiality. She never traveled with an escort, never asked for special treatment, and never announced her position simply because she believed respect for the law should never depend upon a title. A few blocks from the federal courthouse, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Vanessa calmly activated her turn signal, pulled safely to the curb, turned off the engine, and lowered her window before placing both hands where they could be clearly seen. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol vehicle with the confident stride of someone who believed every encounter would end exactly as he expected. His polished boots struck the pavement with deliberate purpose as passing drivers slowed to watch another routine traffic stop unfold. Daniel stopped beside the driver's window without offering a greeting. His eyes briefly scanned the interior before settling on Vanessa. She politely asked if there was a problem. Daniel replied that her vehicle matched one he wanted to verify and requested her driver's license and registration. Vanessa nodded, opened her wallet, and handed over both documents without hesitation. She remained composed, speaking with the same courtesy she extended to everyone she met. Daniel barely acknowledged her cooperation. Instead, he looked from the license to her face several times, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. He questioned whether the address was current, whether the vehicle truly belonged to her, and whether she had borrowed someone else's identification. Vanessa answered each question calmly, never raising her voice, never showing frustration, believing the misunderstanding would soon be resolved. Around them, pedestrians continued walking, though several slowed as curiosity replaced routine. Daniel noticed none of the subtle details that quietly surrounded him. The federal courthouse parking permit attached to the windshield reflected the morning sunlight. A discreet access badge rested partially beneath the leather folder. Vanessa's phone vibrated twice with incoming calls from the clerk's office, but she silenced each one without looking at the screen. Daniel interpreted her calmness as arrogance rather than patience. The conversation gradually shifted away from verifying information and toward assumptions he had already accepted as fact. Vanessa simply waited, trusting that professionalism would eventually prevail. She glanced once toward the courthouse clock tower, standing only a few blocks away, realizing she would soon be late for an important proceeding. Yet she chose not to mention her schedule or reveal her position. To her, every citizen deserved to be treated fairly during a traffic stop, whether they wore a robe, a uniform, or ordinary clothes. She believed character revealed itself most clearly when no one knew who was watching. Unfortunately for Daniel Brooks, that ordinary morning was quietly becoming the moment that would define everything the courthouse would soon learn about the choices he made when he believed no one important was standing in front of him. Daniel Brooks slowly walked around the sedan, letting the silence linger as though it were another tool of authority. He examined the license plate, glanced through the windows, and returned to the driver's side with the same doubtful expression he had worn from the beginning. Vanessa Carter remained exactly where she was, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed despite the growing attention from passing pedestrians. She had spent decades in side courtrooms where patience often spoke louder than emotion, and that discipline now served her well on an ordinary city street. Daniel held up her driver's license between two fingers and frowned. "This does not make sense," he said. "Someone with your background does not usually drive a car like this through this neighborhood on a workday morning." Vanessa answered politely that she was simply traveling to an appointment downtown. She did not volunteer any additional information because she believed every citizen should receive the same treatment without relying on status or occupation. Daniel interpreted her measured tone as avoidance rather than confidence. He asked where she worked. Vanessa smiled politely and replied that she was employed in public service. The answer only deepened his suspicion. A small crowd began forming along the sidewalk as people noticed the unusually long traffic stop. Some quietly watched from a nearby coffee shop patio, while others slowed their pace, sensing tension without fully understanding its cause. Inside her vehicle, Vanessa's phone vibrated again. The display briefly illuminated with another incoming call from the federal courthouse clerk's office before the screen went dark. She ignored it once more, determined to remain cooperative. Until the encounter concluded, Daniel noticed the phone, but paid little attention to the caller identification. Instead, his eyes returned to the driver's license. He studied it for another moment before letting out a dismissive laugh that several nearby pedestrians could hear. "You expect me to believe all of this?" he asked. Vanessa calmly replied that every document he requested had been provided and that she hoped they could resolve the matter professionally. Her steady voice contrasted sharply with his growing frustration. Rather than verifying the information through routine procedures, Daniel allowed his assumptions to guide the conversation. He questioned her honesty, suggested the identification might not belong to her, and implied that respectable positions were reserved for different kinds of people. Vanessa listened without interruption. She neither argued nor attempted to embarrass him. She simply maintained eye contact with quiet dignity, believing that respect for the law required respect even when it was not returned. The spring breeze carried a few small pieces of paper across the street, while traffic continued moving around the scene. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the passing hour. Vanessa realized the hearing she had prepared for so carefully would soon begin without her if the delay continued. Yet she still chose restraint over confrontation. Daniel looked once more at the license in his hand. Without considering the lasting consequences of his choice, he deliberately tore the card into several pieces and let the fragments fall toward the pavement. A collective murmur spread through the onlookers. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly, watching the broken pieces settle beside the curb. She did not raise her voice. She did not react with anger. After a long, quiet moment, she simply looked back at Daniel and said with calm certainty, "Officer, every decision we make eventually asks us to answer for it." Daniel dismissed the words with a confident smile, unaware that the answer to those words was already waiting inside a federal courtroom only a few blocks away. Daniel Brooks brushed imaginary dust from his uniform as though the encounter had already been settled in his favor. He glanced toward the growing group of onlookers with the quiet confidence of someone certain his version of events would never be questioned. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one stepped forward. Vanessa Carter slowly opened her car door after Daniel gave a brief gesture indicating she could step outside. She carefully picked up the torn pieces of her driver's license from the edge of the curb, placing each fragment inside the same leather folder that held her court documents. There was no anger in her movements, only deliberate care, as though every piece represented more than a damaged card. Daniel watched with a faint smile that suggested he believed the moment had already passed. He asked another officer who had recently arrived to perform a quick review of the vehicle, while he continued asking questions that had little connection to the original traffic stop. Vanessa answered only what was necessary, remaining respectful even as the delay stretched longer. The second officer quietly noticed the federal courthouse parking permit attached to the windshield and glanced toward Daniel as if to mention it, but Daniel dismissed the observation with a wave of his hand before returning his attention to Vanessa. A delivery truck rolled by, and for a brief moment the sounds of the city covered the uneasy silence between them. Then Vanessa's phone rang once again. This time the display remained illuminated long enough for several nearby witnesses to notice the words federal court clerk before she silenced the call. Daniel never looked closely enough to read it. He had already decided that nothing she carried could change the opinion he had formed within the first few seconds of meeting her. Across the street, two office workers quietly discussed the situation while another passerby raised a phone, apparently recording the unusually long stop from a distance. Daniel remained completely unconcerned. He believed experience had taught him to trust his instincts above everything else. Vanessa looked toward the courthouse, rising above the downtown skyline, only a few blocks away. She knew the morning calendar would soon begin, and she also knew dozens of attorneys, court staff, and litigants would be wondering why she had not yet arrived. Even then, she chose not to identify herself. Deep inside, she believed that fairness meant allowing an encounter to reveal its own truth without relying on titles or influence. Finally, Daniel stepped back from the vehicle and handed Vanessa a written notice explaining that she would need to replace her damaged identification before driving again. The irony escaped him completely. He had personally destroyed the very document he now claimed she lacked. Vanessa accepted the paper without complaint. She thanked him in a calm voice that surprised several people standing nearby. Daniel nodded once, convinced he had demonstrated firm authority and proper judgment. As Vanessa carefully closed her folder, making sure every torn piece remained inside, she quietly said, "I hope the next time we meet, we both have the opportunity to be heard before conclusions are made." Daniel barely reacted. He turned toward his patrol car, spoke casually with his fellow officer, and drove away believing the morning had been routine. Behind him, Vanessa remained standing beside her sedan for another moment, taking one slow breath before continuing toward the federal courthouse, carrying with her not resentment, but undeniable evidence that some of the most important cases begin long before anyone enters a courtroom. The federal courthouse stood only a few hundred yards away, its limestone columns catching the late morning sunlight as Vanessa Carter quietly parked in her reserved space beneath the judicial parking structure. She gathered the leather folder against her chest, making certain every torn piece of her driver's license remained inside before stepping toward the employee entrance. Court officers greeted her with respectful smiles, but they immediately noticed she was several minutes later than usual. The chief courtroom deputy approached with visible concern and asked whether everything was all right. Vanessa simply answered that she had experienced an unexpected delay on the way to work and suggested they proceed with the day's schedule. She offered no complaints and mentioned no names. To her, the responsibility of the court always came before personal frustration. Inside her chambers, she carefully placed the damaged pieces of a license across her desk. For a brief moment, she studied them in silence, not because of the inconvenience they caused, but because they represented something far more troubling. She had spent years reminding new lawyers that every person who entered a courtroom deserved equal dignity under the law. That principle was not merely written in legal opinions. It lived in ordinary moments between ordinary people. She quietly gathered the fragments into a small evidence envelope, more out of habit than emotion, then turned her attention to the docket waiting for her review. Outside the chambers, clerks organized files while attorneys hurried through hallways rehearsing arguments. None of them realized the judge had already become part of the story that would soon reach the courtroom itself. Meanwhile, several miles away, Daniel Brooks finished his shift report with complete confidence. He described the traffic stop as routine, convinced every decision he had made would withstand scrutiny. A fellow officer casually mentioned that the woman had seemed unusually composed throughout the encounter and wondered whether she might have been someone connected to the courthouse. Daniel dismissed the idea with an easy laugh, insisting that important people always announce themselves immediately. He believed silence meant weakness rather than self-control. Before leaving the station, he glanced at the notification reminding him about his scheduled federal court testimony later that week. It concerned a case in which he would appear as a key witness, something he viewed as another opportunity to demonstrate professionalism before a federal judge he had never met. Without realizing it, he folded the notice and slipped it into the same notebook where he had recorded details from the traffic stop earlier that morning. The names rested only inches apart on paper, yet the connection never crossed his mind. Back at the courthouse, Vanessa reviewed the witness list for the upcoming hearing. Her eyes moved steadily down the page until they paused on one familiar name, Officer Daniel Brooks. She remained perfectly still for several seconds, then closed the folder without the slightest change in expression. She did not request reassignment. She did not contact court administrators. She simply instructed her staff to ensure every required record, body camera submission, and supporting document listed in the case file had been received according to standard procedure. Every instruction reflected ordinary judicial practice. Yet together, they quietly ensured that the courtroom would rely upon complete facts rather than assumptions. Neither Daniel nor anyone else understood that the ordinary paperwork moving through the federal system that afternoon would soon become the foundation upon which truth, accountability, and professional integrity would be measured with equal weight. The morning of the hearing arrived with the quiet precision that defined every federal courtroom. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long reflections across polished marble floors as attorneys organized their files and court staff prepared for another day of proceedings. Officer Daniel Brooks entered the courthouse wearing the same confidence that had carried him through countless appearances. He greeted a few familiar deputies, exchanged brief conversation with another witness, and adjusted his uniform before walking toward courtroom 4. Nothing about the building suggested that this day would be different from any other. He reviewed his testimony one final time, convinced that facts would support every decision he had made. Across the hallway, Vanessa Carter walked from her chambers with measured composure, carrying only the case file and a notebook filled with handwritten observations. The torn pieces of her driver's license remained sealed inside an evidence envelope, resting quietly among her personal materials. She had made no effort to influence the assignment, no request to avoid the proceeding, and no attempt to contact anyone involved outside established judicial procedures. Her responsibility remained exactly what it had always been, to ensure that every person entering her courtroom received fairness under the law. As spectators found their seats and attorneys arranged their exhibits, the courtroom deputy called for everyone to rise. Daniel stood with the others, his attention fixed casually toward the entrance until the familiar figure appeared. Time seemed to hesitate. The woman from the traffic stop walked calmly toward the bench with the same steady expression she had carried on the sidewalk 3 days earlier. There was no anger in her face, no sign of satisfaction, only the quiet confidence expected of someone entrusted with administering justice. Daniel stared without moving. His heartbeat seemed louder than the deputy's announcement as the words echoed across the courtroom. The Honorable Judge Vanessa Carter presiding. For several seconds, Daniel could neither look away nor convince himself that he was mistaken. Every overlooked detail returned at once. The courthouse parking permit, the unanswered calls from the clerk's office, the access badge partially hidden beneath the leather folder, the remarkable patience she had shown while he questioned her without evidence. Each memory fit together with perfect clarity, forming a truth he could no longer ignore. Judge Carter took her seat beneath the seal of the United States and calmly reviewed the docket before lifting her eyes toward the courtroom. Her expression remained professional and impartial. She greeted counsel, confirmed appearances, and proceeded through the opening matters with the same even tone she used in every hearing. She gave no indication that she recognized Daniel, as she certainly offered no personal remarks about their previous encounter. That restraint unsettled him far more than any accusation could have. The attorneys noticed his unusual silence, while several court staff quietly exchanged puzzled glances at the change in his demeanor. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the witness table, suddenly aware that authority looked very different inside a courtroom than it had beside the road. Here, assumptions carried no weight. Evidence mattered. Procedure mattered. Integrity mattered. As Judge Carter turned to the first matter on the calendar, she instructed the clerk to confirm that every exhibit, recording, and required submission listed in the case file had been received before testimony would begin. Her words were entirely routine, spoken without emphasis. Yet Daniel felt an unmistakable sense that every choice made 3 days earlier had quietly followed him into this room, where only facts, patience, and accountability would be allowed to speak. The courtroom settled into a steady rhythm as witnesses were sworn in and attorneys presented the first portions of their arguments. Judge Vanessa Carter listened with complete attention, occasionally making brief notes in the margin of the case file, while maintaining the same calm expression she had worn since entering the bench. Nothing in her voice suggested personal emotion. Every ruling followed established procedure. Every instruction reflected the discipline expected inside a federal courtroom. Officer Daniel Brooks remained seated near the witness stand, but the confidence that had accompanied him into the building had quietly disappeared. He answered preliminary questions with professional courtesy, yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to the traffic stop that neither of them acknowledged aloud. After the initial testimony concluded, one attorney informed the court that additional evidence had recently been submitted through standard discovery procedures. Judge Carter nodded and instructed the clerk to verify that every item had been properly entered into the record before any further testimony continued. The clerk confirmed that supplemental materials included dispatch communications, incident reports, patrol vehicle recordings, and body camera footage associated with the officer's recent field activity. The request was entirely consistent with federal procedure whenever evidence required authentication before presentation. Judge Carter simply replied that the court would review every admissible exhibit in accordance with the applicable rules of evidence. Her tone remained measured and impartial, leaving no room for speculation about motive. Daniel felt an unfamiliar weight settle across his shoulders. He remembered activating his body camera before approaching Vanessa's vehicle, just as department policy required. At the time, he had given little thought to the recording because he believed every decision reflected proper judgment. Now he realized that cameras preserved far more than spoken words. They preserved timing, tone, patience, interruptions, and every opportunity to choose professionalism over assumption. The attorney continued explaining that complete documentation allowed the court to evaluate events within their full context rather than relying upon memory alone. Judge Carter agreed that accurate records protected everyone involved, including officers performing their duties and citizens exercising their rights. Those words echoed quietly through the courtroom. Several spectators nodded almost imperceptibly, while the attorneys continued organizing exhibits without any sign that the proceeding had become unusual. Daniel looked briefly toward the bench. Judge Carter never returned his glance. She remained focused upon the law rather than the individual seated before her. That quiet discipline revealed something Daniel had never considered during the traffic stop. Real authority did not require raised voices, public displays, or personal victories. It required consistency, restraint, and respect for procedures that applied equally to every person. As the clerk finished cataloging the evidence, another routine matter unexpectedly drew attention. The supplemental report referenced the same traffic stop that had delayed Judge Carter's arrival at the courthouse several days earlier. A brief silence settled across the room as the connection became apparent to those reviewing the documents. No dramatic reactions followed. Instead, the courtroom remained composed, allowing the official record to speak for itself. Judge Carter paused only long enough to confirm that all parties had received identical copies of every submission before directing counsel to proceed according to the established schedule. Daniel slowly understood that no one needed to accuse him of anything inside this courtroom. The facts would arrive in their proper order, supported by documents, recordings, and testimony gathered through ordinary legal process. For the first time since putting on his uniform that morning, he recognized that the strongest force inside the room was not power or position. It was the quiet persistence of evidence, patiently waiting for its opportunity to be heard. The proceedings continued with the deliberate pace that defined every federal courtroom, where patience carried more authority than volume, and every conclusion rested upon verifiable facts rather than personal opinion. The clerk confirmed that the supplemental evidence had been properly authenticated, and the attorneys acknowledged receipt of the complete record before moving forward. Judge Vanessa Carter reviewed each filing with careful attention, occasionally asking brief, procedural questions that demonstrated the same impartiality she had shown from the moment she entered the bench. Nothing about her conduct suggested that the officer seated before her had any personal connection to the evidence now entering the official record. She treated every document exactly as she would have in any other case, allowing the process itself to remain the focus. As the body camera recording became part of the court file, the attorneys carefully referenced specific portions that illustrated the sequence of events during the traffic stop. The discussion centered upon procedure, documentation, and professional standards rather than emotion. The recording captured the complete interaction from beginning to end, preserving details that memory alone could easily overlook. It reflected the length of the stop, the questions asked, the responses given, and the condition of the identification presented during the encounter. It also confirmed that several visible indicators connected the driver to the federal courthouse, details that had been present throughout the encounter even though they had not influenced the officer's decisions. Daniel Brooks listened as each reference quietly reconstructed the morning he had considered routine. For the first time, he recognized that confidence built upon assumptions could disappear when measured against a complete factual record. Across the courtroom, several observers remained, focused on the legal discussion rather than the individuals involved. The atmosphere stayed calm, respectful, and professional, yet the significance of the evidence gradually became impossible to ignore. Judge Carter asked only those questions necessary to clarify the record, reminding counsel that accurate documentation protected the credibility of both public officials and private citizens. She emphasized that consistent procedures strengthened public trust because they ensured accountability without prejudice or favoritism. Her words carried no personal criticism. They reflected principles she had applied throughout her judicial career. Following the evidentiary discussion, counsel informed the court that the materials would also be forwarded through the appropriate administrative channels for independent review under departmental policy. Judge Carter acknowledged the statement without comment, noting only that matters outside the scope of the present hearing would proceed according to their own established procedures. Daniel understood exactly what those words meant. Whatever happened next would not depend upon personal feelings inside the courtroom. It would follow the same institutional processes that governed every public servant entrusted with authority. As the hearing drew toward its conclusion, the room remained remarkably quiet. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, and no public humiliation. Instead, the greatest shift had occurred almost invisibly. The assumptions that once gave Daniel certainty had steadily given way to documented facts examined through lawful procedure. Looking across the courtroom, he finally understood something that had escaped him only days earlier. Respect for the law could never begin with a uniform alone. It had to begin with the equal dignity owed to every person before a single question was asked, before a single conclusion was reached, and long before any courtroom was ever called to decide what the truth had always been. When the hearing concluded, the attorneys quietly gathered their files while the spectators slowly filtered into the courthouse hallway, carrying with them the unmistakable feeling that they had witnessed something far more significant than an ordinary legal proceeding. Judge Vanessa Carter remained on the bench only long enough to complete the final administrative matters before thanking counsel for their professionalism and adjourning the session. The sound of the gavel was gentle, yet its meaning lingered long after the courtroom emptied. Daniel Brooks remained seated for a brief moment, staring at the polished wooden table where certainty had slowly given way to reflection. No one celebrated his discomfort, and no one attempted to shame him. The institution around him had responded exactly as it was designed to respond, with facts, procedure, and accountability rather than emotion. During the days that followed, the appropriate administrative offices began their independent review using the same documentation discussed in court. The body camera recording, dispatch records, written reports, and witness statements were evaluated according to established departmental policies. Daniel fully cooperated throughout the process, answering every question presented to him. The review concluded that several professional standards had not been met during the traffic stop, resulting in disciplinary action, mandatory retraining, and additional oversight before he could resume full responsibilities. The outcome was neither dramatic nor vindictive. It reflected the principle that public trust is preserved when institutions acknowledge mistakes and work to correct them. Vanessa Carter never requested special treatment and never attempted to influence the review beyond fulfilling her judicial responsibilities. When asked privately by a colleague why she had remained so composed throughout the entire experience, she answered with quiet simplicity that justice loses its strength the moment it becomes personal. Her responsibility had never been to defeat another person. It had always been to protect the integrity of the law itself. Those words quietly spread throughout the courthouse, repeated by clerks, attorneys, and young law students who understood that true leadership often revealed itself through restraint rather than recognition. Several weeks later, Daniel attended one of the department's professional ethics seminars. The instructor spoke about impartiality, public confidence, and the responsibility that accompanies every badge. For the first time in many years, Daniel listened without believing the lesson was intended for someone else. He understood that authority could open a conversation, but only character determined how that conversation would be remembered. The memory of a calm woman standing beside her car, choosing dignity instead of anger, remained with him far longer than any disciplinary letter ever could. Outside the courthouse one quiet afternoon, Daniel happened to see Judge Carter leaving the building. Their eyes met for only a moment. He offered a respectful nod, and she returned it with the same calm professionalism she had shown from the beginning. No further words were necessary. Both understood that the most important lesson had never been about a damaged driver's license or a single traffic stop. It had been about the obligation to see the humanity in every person before making a judgment. As the courthouse doors closed behind them and the American flag moved gently above the entrance, one truth remained stronger than every assumption that had come before it. A badge may represent authority, but integrity is what gives authority its meaning. And justice begins not when a courtroom opens, but the very first moment one person chooses to treat another with equal dignity and respect.